All right, lesson 4.2 of Trig. We are going to graph our sine and cosine graphs. We're going to take it to the next level. We're now going to do horizontal and vertical shifts of these graphs today. So we are going to take this graph of y equals the sine of x plus 3 pi fourths over a period. So the first thing I like to do is to take what's inside these parentheses right here between the 0. So actually I want to hit on some of the words first. There is no reflections, because we don't have a negative coefficient in the front. If we did, that would reflect over the x-axis. If you have a negative x for x, that would flip it over the y-axis. So do remember your reflections. All right, if I took this basic sine graph right here, the sine graph says it starts at 0, 0, and this is what it would look like. Except we're doing something to it. Take a look at that equation. How do you think we're going to shift this graph right here? So going back to some stuff for college algebra, that would mean we'd shift it to the left 3 pi fourths, and that would be correct. So we need to take this graph, which is stretched from 0 to 2 pi, and we're going to move the whole thing to the left 3 pi fourths of a unit. Now, some of you might have a little bit of a tough time finding the multiple choice graphs to match that. So we will talk about how to make a table of points from this today. Now, some of the graphs in the homework, you click on the sine graph. That was the basic parent function. You tell it reflection, there was none. Amplitude, absolute value of the number in front of that, which is a 1. The period would be 2 pi divided by the coefficient of x, which is a 1, so just 2 pi. Then you're going to tell it you have a phase shift to the left 3 pi fourths. So that means you have to tell it negative 3 pi fourths. Now in the homework system, you will use pi for pi. You just type in negative 3 pi, and it'll put the pi symbol in for you, and then divide by 4. And that'll take care of your phase shift. There isn't a vertical shift to this because we add something at the end that would just be a plus 0. So there was no vertical shift. So the ones that want you to graph with the words, this is all you would type in, and it takes care of the graph for you. Now, some of them will be multiple choice graphs, and a table of points would be very helpful. For the table of points, you will take what's inside here between 0 and 2 pi. Again, because a full cycle for sine and cosine goes all the way around the circle to 2 pi units. So we're going to go 0 to 2 pi. I am going to subtract 3 pi fourths from each one of these. So the number on the left is negative 3 pi fourths. This right here is 8 pi fourths. Take away 3 pi fourths. That would be 5 pi fourths. So this is the ends of my table. Now I want the midpoint between those two. If I add negative 3 fourths plus the 5 fourths, that would give me 2 pi fourths. Half of 2 pi fourths would be 1 pi fourth. Add these two together, that's going to give me negative 2 pi fourths. Half of negative 2 pi fourths would be negative 1 pi fourth. Add pi fourth and 5 pi fourths together. Those two would be 6 pi fourths. Half of 6 is 3 pi fourths. Now this was a sine graph from the statement SOHCAHTOA. Remember the graph for the sine then starts at 0. So we're going to go 0, 1, 0, negative 1, 0. There's no value of a to multiply by. There is no vertical shift. So this is going to be my x's for my x-axis. This is my y values for the y-axis. We take and plot the points. See, here pi fourth is at 0. There's the point pi fourth 0. Okay, 5 pi fourths is 0. There's 5 pi fourths 0. The point in between them is at negative 1, right there. Okay? So this time, y equals negative 2 cosine of x minus pi third. So first thing I should look for is a reflection. Yep, I have a negative number out front. That is going to reflect this across the x-axis. Meaning this was my original cosine graph right here. So it's reflected across the x-axis. So this high point, instead of starting there, is going to start down here at negative 2. But remember, it is also shifted to the right pi third. So instead of it starting here at 2, 0, 2, it's going to come down here to negative 0, negative 2, but you're going to move it to the right pi thirds of a unit. So it'll be at pi thirds negative 2 is where that first point's going to be. All right, let's do a little bit more work with that. So again, a negative coefficient is reflected. The absolute value of that negative 2 is the amplitude of 2. The period, 2 pi divided by 1 in front of the x. The phase shift is going to go to the right pi thirds. If you set that equal to 0, that would be pi thirds. So it's positive pi thirds. There was no vertical shift. All right, so my table of points. I take what's inside here between 0 and 2 pi. I add 1/3 pi to 0. I add 1/3 to 2. 2 is the same thing as 6/3 plus 1/3. That's going to be 7 pi thirds on the end. These are the end points for my table. Now I want the average. I want the midpoint between those two. Adding those two together gives me 8/3. Half of 8 is 4, so there's 4 pi thirds. Add these two. That's 5 pi thirds. But I want a half of 5 pi thirds. A half of 5 thirds. That's 5/6. Add those two. That's 11 pi thirds. So a half of 11 pi thirds would be 11 pi 6. Again, this was cosine. Cosine normally will start at 1, 0, negative 1, 0. We then multiply by that coefficient of negative 2 out front with every single one of those. So you notice that negative has already taken care of that reflection as well also. And there's your graph. See, the original would have been up here at positive 2, but it's been reflected over the axis and moved to the right pi thirds. There's the starting point now. And there is my graph. All right, so y equals 3/2 cosine of 2x minus pi. So, reflection. Nope, there's not a negative x, there's not a negative there, none. Amplitude. The opposite value of the number in front of the word cosine or sine. So the opposite value of 3/2, that would be 3/2. The period, that's going to be 2 pi divided by the coefficient of this x. So 2 pi divided by 2. That would be pi. The phase shift, take this equal to 0. So 2x minus pi equals 0. That would mean add pi, divide by 2, so it's to the right pi half. A vertical translation, there is no plus anything at the end. So there is not a vertical translation. So again, for some of these, you just literally click on the graph and then you go click on these words, put the numbers in, and it graphs it. Some of them are multiple choice graphs. So for the multiple choice graphs, the tables work out nicely. Now, this was that basic cosine graph. So here is the basic cosine graph. The amplitude was 3/2. That means this should go up to 1.5 and down to 1.5. But it was moved over to the right pi halves units, and the full stretch across here is only pi units. So the full stretch is pi, and I'm going to move it over pi half to about here for that new starting point. So here we go for the table. Take the 2x minus pi, what's in here, between 0 and 2 pi. Add pi, and add pi. So that's 3 pi, that's pi, and now divide each one by 2. That's where we got these numbers. Now for the table, 1/2 plus 3/2, that would be 4/2. Half of 4 is 2, so this is 2 pi halves. 2 pi halves plus 1 pi half, that's 3 pi halves. A half of 3/2 is 3/4. And again, 1's the same thing as 2/2 plus 3/2, that's 5/2. And half of 5/2 is 5/4. Cosine starts with the value of a, or originally 1. And then we times everything by the 3/2. And there's my x's for my x-axis, and here's my y's for the y-axis. Okay, what's different about this one? I hope most of you are thinking, oh, it has a vertical shift. See, this has this -2 there. That's not a coefficient for the word cosine. It's not with the x. It's over by itself. I prefer to rewrite this as 3 cosine of 2x and then the -2 at the end. Personally, that's how I like to write my vertical shifts at the end. I don't like to write them in the front. Just different books do them differently. All right, so I am going to look for reflections. I don't have one. I don't have a negative x. I don't have a negative coefficient. Amplitude, that'd be the opposite value of 3. The period, 2 pi divided by 2, so it's pi units long. The phase shift, I doesn't have one, because if I set 2x equal to 0, it's x is 0, so no phase shift. But we do have a vertical shift, and hopefully you're thinking down 2. So the vertical shift is down 2. So again, the graphs with the words, this is what you do. Now, I kind of came up with a little silly statement the other day, and so we're going RVN. So because you always want to do the reflection first and the vertical last, and that's going RVN. So reflection first, vertical last, everything else in the middle doesn't matter the order for the middle. But it does matter, you want to do reflections first, vertical shifts last. If that vertical shift is not last, you might not get it right. So make sure those are last. All right, so for the table of points, I take the 2x between 0 and 2 pi, divide each one by 2. So I've got 0 and pi for the ends of my table. Again, I'm going to do the midpoint of 0 and pi, add those together, and half of it. Half of pi halves, pi fourths. 1/2 plus 1, that's 2 halves, plus 1/2, that's 3 halves. And half of 3 halves would be 3/4. It is a cosine. Cosine, the x value goes 1, 0, negative 1, 0, 1. Multiply by this 3 next. So everything times 3. And then everything down to -2 from this, -2, -2, -2, -2 from every single y value. And there's your new graph. So this time, we have a lot going on in the equation. So when you're looking at that, I'm hoping you're thinking, okay, that's a vertical shift of 4. That is a reflection across the x-axis. Amplitude is 2. Period, 2 pi divided by 3. Phase shift, right pi thirds. But the order you need to do all that in, if you just think RVing, we're going RVing. I want to do the reflection first and the vertical translation last. Then the middle, whatever order you want. All right, so I rewrote the equations. I personally like the plus 4 at the end. That there, negative 2 stays with the word sign. So reflection, a negative coefficient in the front flips it over the x-axis. All right, amplitude, the opposite value of that negative 2 is 2. So it goes up to 2, down to 0, down to 2, so forth. All right, after that, the period, 2 pi divided by 3. The phase shift, take what's inside here equal to 0 and solve it for x. So it'd be add pi, divide by 3, to the right pi thirds. So it's positive pi thirds. The vertical shift, have a plus 4 at the end, so it is moved up 4. If I did a table of points, I want this 3x minus pi between 0 and 2 pi. So we add pi, that's 3 pi, divide everything by 3. So pi third and pi. That's the endpoints of my table. 1/3 plus 3/3, that would be 4/3. Half of 4 is 2/3. 2/3 plus 1/3, that's 3/3. I want a half of 3/3. 2/3 plus 3/3, that'd be 5/3. Half of 5/3, that's 5/6. Sign, that's the y value on that unit circle. Starting to the right, the sign would be 0. 1, 0, negative 1, 0. Multiply everything by this value of a of negative 2. So we take negative 2 times every single one of these values. Now we shift every single one of these up 4. So we shift all those up 4, and there's the new points for my graph. So this is the original x's, this is the new y's, and that's how you match up your graph. So again, like I said, the ones where you just type in this information into the graph and it graphs for you, that's not as hard as some of these multiple choice graphs are a little bit difficult trying to figure out what these points are for those graphs. That ends lesson 4.2. If you need some help, come on in to see me in the morning. I wish you the best of luck. Have a great day.